All right, chapter 6, Tortilla Flat. Excuse me. So this was called How Three Sinful Men Through Contrition Attained Peace, How Danny's Friends Swore Comradeship. Remember Danny's house that he lent to his friends just got burned down. When the sun was clear of the pines and the ground was warm and the night's dew was drying on the geranium leaves, Danny came out on his porch to sit in the sunshine and to muse warmly of certain happenings. He slipped off his shoes and wriggled his toes on the sun-warmed boards of the porch. He had walked down earlier in the morning and viewed the square black ashes and twisted plumbing which had been his other house. He had indulged in a little conventional anger against careless friends, had mourned for a moment over that transitory quality of earthly property which made spiritual property so much more valuable. He had thought over the ruin of his status as a man with a house to rent, and all this clutter of necessary and decent emotion having been satisfied and swept away. He had finally slipped into his true emotion, one of relief that at least one of his burdens was removed. If it were still there, I would be covetous of the rent, he thought. My friends have been cool toward me because they owed me money. Now we can be free and happy again. But Danny knew he must discipline his friends a little or they would consider him soft. Therefore, as he sat on his porch, warding off flies with a moving hand which conveyed more warning than threat to the flies, he went over the things he must say to his friends before he allowed them back into the corral of his affection. He must show them that he was not a man to be imposed upon, but he yearned to get it over and to be once more that Danny whom everyone loved, that Danny whom people sought out when they had a gallon of wine or a piece of meat. As the owner of 2 houses, he had been considered rich, and he had missed a great many tidbits. Pelon and Pablo and Jesus Maria Cocaran slept a long time on the pine needles in the forest. It had been a night of terrible excitement, and they were tired, but at length the sun shone into their faces with the noonday ardor, and the ants walked on them, and 2 blue jays stood on the ground nearby, calling them all manner of sharp names. What finished their sleep, though, was a picnic party which settled just on the other side of the bush from them and opened a big lunch basket from which moving smells drifted to Pelon and Pablo and Jesus Maria. They awakened, they sat up, and then the enormity of their situation burst upon them. "How did the fire start?" asked Pablo plaintively, and no one knew. "Perhaps," said Jesus Maria, "we had better go to another town for a while, to Watsonville or to Salinas. Those are nice towns." Malone pulled the brassiere from his pocket and ran his fingers over its pink smoothness, and he held it to the sunlight and looked through it. That would only delay matters, he decided. I think it would be better to go to Danny and confess our fault, like little children to a father. Then he can't say anything without being sorry, and besides, have we not this present for Mrs. Morales? His friends nodded agreement. Ballone's eyes strayed through the thick brush to the picnic party, and particularly to that huge lunch basket from which came the penetrating odors of defiled eggs. Ballone's nose wrinkled a little like a rabbit's. He smiled in a quiet reverie. "I'm going to walk, my friends. In a little while I will meet you at the quarry. Do not bring the basket if you can help it." They watched sadly as Pilon got up and walked away. Through the trees in a direction at right angles to the picnic and the basket, Pablo and Jesus Maria were not surprised a few moments later to hear a dog bark, a rooster crow, high shrill laughter, the snarl of a wild cat, a little short scream, and a cry for help. But the picnic party was surprised and fascinated. The 2 men and 2 women left their basket and trotted away towards these versatile sounds. Pablo and Jesus Maria obeyed Pilon. They did not take the basket, but always afterwards their hats and their shirts were stained with deviled eggs. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the 3 penitents walked slowly towards Danny's house. Their arms were loaded with offerings of reconciliation, oranges and apples and bananas, bottles of olives and pickles, sandwiches of pressed ham, egg sandwiches, bottles of soda pop, a paper carton of potato salad, and a copy of the Saturday Evening Post. Danny saw them coming, and he stood up and tried to remember the things he had to say. They lined up in front of him and hung their heads. "Dogs of dogs," Danny called them, and "thieves of decent folks' other house." Or "thieves of decent folks' his other house, and spawn of cuttlefish." He named their mother's cows and their father's ancient sheep. Malone opened the bag he held and exposed the ham sandwiches, and Danny said he had no more trust in friends, that his faith had been frostbitten and his friendship trampled upon, and then he began to have a little trouble remembering, for Pablo had taken 2 deviled eggs, or I think I'm saying deviled, but deviled eggs. Pablo had taken 2 deviled eggs out of his bosom, but Danny went back to the grand generation and criticized the virtue of its women and the potency of its men. Pelon pulled the pink brassiere from his pocket and let it dangle listlessly from his fingers. Danny forgot everything then. He sat down on the porch and his friend sat down, and the packages came open. They ate to a point of discomfort. It was an hour later when they reclined at ease on the porch, giving attention to little besides digestion, when Danny asked casually, as about some far-off object, "How did the fire start?" "We don't know," Pelon explained. "We went to sleep and then it started. Perhaps we have enemies." "Perhaps," said Pablo devoutly. "Perhaps God had a finger in it. Who can say what makes the good God act the way he does?" added Jesus Maria. When Pelon handed over the brassiere and explained how it was a present for Mrs. Morales, Danny was reticent. He eyed the brassiere with some skepticism. His friends, he felt, were flattering Mrs. Morales. "That is not a woman to give presents to," he said finally. "Too often we are tied to women by the silk stockings we give them." He could not explain to his friends the coolness that had come to his relationship with Miss Morales since he was the owner of only one house, nor could he, in courtesy to Mrs. Morales, describe his own pleasure at that coolness. "I will put this little thing away," he said. "Someday it may be of use to someone." When the evening came and it was dark, they went into the house and built a fire of cones in the airtight stove. Danny, in proof of his forgiveness, brought out a quart of grappa and shared its fire with his hands. And shared its fire with his friends. They settled easily into the new life. "It is too bad Miss Morales' chickens are all dead," Pelon observed. "But even here was no bar to happiness. She is going to buy 2 dozen new ones on Monday," said Danny. Pelon smiled contentedly. "Those hens of Mrs. Soto's were no good," he said. "I told Mrs. Soto they needed oyster shells, but she paid no attention to me." They drank the quart of grappa, or wine. They drank the quart of grappa, and there was just enough to promote the sweetness of comradeship. "It is good to have friends," said Danny. "How lonely it is in the world if there are no friends to sit with one and to share one's grappa, or one's sandwiches," Pelon added quickly. Pablo was not quite over his remorse, for he suspected the true state of celestial politics which had caused the burning of the house. "In all the world there are few friends like thee, Danny. It is not given to many to have such solace." Before Danny sank completely under the waves of his frenzy, he sounded one warning. "I want all of you to keep out of my bed," he ordered. "That is one thing I must have to myself." Although no one had mentioned it, each of the 4 knew they were all going to live in Danny's house. Pelon sighed with pleasure. Gone was the worry of the rent, gone the responsibility of owing money. No longer was he a tenant, but a guest. In his mind, he gave thanks for the burning of the other house. We will all be happy here, Danny," he said. "In the evenings we will sit by the fire and our friends will come in to visit, and sometimes maybe we will have a glass of wine to drink for friendship's sake." Then Jesus Maria, in a frenzy of gratefulness, made a rash promise. It was a grappa that did it, in the night of the fire and all the deviled eggs. He felt that he had received great gifts, and he wanted to distribute a gift. "It shall be our burden and our duty to see that there is always food in the house for Danny," he declaimed. "Never shall our friend go hungry." Pelon and Pablo looked up in alarm, but the thing was said, a beautiful and generous thing. No man could with impunity destroy it. Even as Jesus Maria understood after it was said the magnitude of his statement, they could only hope that Danny would forget it. "For," Pelon mused to himself, "if this promise were enforced, it would be worse than rent. It would be slavery." "We swear it, Danny," he said. "We swear it, Danny," he said. They sat about the stove with tears in their eyes, and their love for one another was almost unbearable. Pablo wiped his wet eyes with the back of his hand, and he echoed Pelon's remark. "We shall be very happy living here," he said. Danny's an idiot, and Pelon's in control. Straight up.